Can everyone see that? Okay. All right,
Yep.
Lovely. So yeah, thanks very much everyone for joining us today. I'm Carolyn Tarrant. I'm based at the University of Leicester. I'm a social scientist by background and a qualitative researcher. So I use qualitative methods in my research around kind of healthcare and healthcare improvement. So I've been invited to give this session today on thematic analysis of qualitative data. So what I'd like to do is give an overview of the thematic analysis approach and talk through the steps involved, and then say a little bit about reliability and reflexivity in qualitative research. So I hope to talk for about 40-45 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the chat as we go. And I also sort of leave time for people to put their hands up and ask questions if you have any at the end. Okay. So if you are here, presumably you know what we're talking about when we talk about qualitative research, but just to make sure we're on the same page, when we're thinking about qualitative data, we're thinking about non-numerical data. So like this is quite a helpful definition. We can think about qualitative data as being anything that, any findings that are not arrived at by means of statistical procedures or other means of quantification. So we're looking at data that might come from interviews, from focus groups, maybe from observations of practice. We might be looking at free text data from surveys, online discussion boards, and so on. So we're generally interested in exploring people's experiences, their perceptions, their behaviours, their practices, and asking questions around how and why. So how people feel about living with a particular condition, why a certain service might operate the way that it does, rather than trying to quantify or count anything. So the approach to analysing qualitative data is kind of quite different, as you might expect, to analysing statistical or numerical data. And there are lots of different approaches out there, so some of which you might have come across things like grounded theory or discourse analysis. And most approaches to analysing qualitative data have got several things in common. So generally they will involve starting by familiarising yourself with your data. So for example, if you've got interview transcripts, reading and rereading them to really immerse yourself in your data. Working through a process of identifying what we might call units of meaning in the data, so key chunks of text that are relevant to you in answering your research question, and applying labels or codes to those small chunks of text so that we can sort them and we can find them easily. And then when we've done that, starting to look for patterns across your data set, so within individual interviews or across interviews or across different patient or healthcare professional groups. I think a really fundamental thing to recognise about qualitative analysis is that it's reliant on the researcher doing the work. So it's not that just we put our data into a software package and we click a few buttons and we get our analysis out at the end. There's a lot of work involved for the researcher in really thinking about how does their data answer the research question, how they want to interpret what's in their data, how they're going to make sense of it. So if we're getting into a process of qualitative analysis, we need to make sure we've got enough time to do it properly, because it can be very labour intensive, very demanding, and it's very dependent on the work you do as a researcher in interpreting your data. Okay, so to go on to look at a thematic analysis approach. So as I said, thematic analysis is just one alternative approach to analysing qualitative data. Different approaches like grounded theory and discourse analysis have particular functions, so they might be really well suited for certain research questions. They might come with expectations about the sort of data that you have. So for example, discourse analysis is very much focused on the kind of conversation and the language and words used in a conversation. So that might be really a useful approach when, for example, you might want to look at GP consultations and the sort of language that's used. So I think thematic analysis is a really useful approach because it doesn't come with any kind of expectations about the type of data that you've got or the sort of sample that you've got. It really just provide a sort of toolkit and a set of methods that you can apply to any qualitative data that you might have. So thematic analysis was an approach that's set out by Braun and Clark in the early 2000s, and they sort of drew together some of the methods and techniques from other approaches to qualitative analysis that had been previously established. And I think they took quite a pragmatic approach. So really what they wanted to do was to put together this toolkit that was quite accessible and was quite widely applicable, but was very sort of systematic. So thematic analysis is what we might call a pattern-based approach. So this is the sort of approach you want to use if you are looking to identify patterns and commonalities and themes across a data set. So for example, looking at similarities in experiences of patients with a similar condition. As I said, it's just a method, it's a set of tools and techniques for analysis, it's not a methodology. You can use it to address lots of different sorts of research questions. There's no requirements around the sort of data that you've got. So, you know, we can use it to analyse most types of qualitative data. So this is the original paper from Braun and Clark, where they set out the steps involved in thematic analysis. And I'm going to kind of walk you through those steps now. I think that it's really helpful that the kind of steps in the analysis are set out so clearly. And particularly if you're relatively new to qualitative research, I do think it's quite an accessible approach in terms of being really clear in terms of the steps that you would work through to analyse your data. So on the slide, I've got the 6 phases of thematic analysis. So the first, as you might expect, as I've already suggested, is to spend time familiarising yourself with your data. So you might have some interviews that you've audio recorded or focus groups, and the first step, if you're transcribing the data yourself, would be to do that transcribing, and that's a good way to immerse yourself and become really familiar with that data. It might be that you've got a transcribing service, so you're not doing that transcribing, but you can still become really familiar with your data by spending time reading and rereading your transcripts, possibly listening back to some of the audio recordings, so you're kind of picking up the nuances again, and noting down any initial ideas that you might have around the interesting things that are jumping out to you from your data. So then the next step is the first kind of almost formal step of thematic analysis, is generating initial codes. So this is where you systematically work through your data, identifying pieces of text that are interesting and relevant and applying labels or codes to them. And we'll have a look at what that might look like in relation to some transcripts in a minute. Once you've coded your data, the next stage is searching for themes. So this is where you're really starting to pull your data together. So to pull data extracts from your interviews, from across your interviews together, where they're talking about similar things and grouping them to identify what those common themes are across your data set. Once you've got your initial themes, you need to check those back against your data set. So you might have come up with a set of initial themes that you think represent your findings. You then need to go back to your data set and check your coding and check that your themes represent what's there in your data. And then you might like to draw out a thematic map of the analysis where you show how your themes are related to each other. From then on, you're really working with those themes. So you might need to do some more work around deciding what the name of your theme is going to be and writing out a description of what that theme is talking about. And then producing your report where you write about your themes and draw on the data. And again, I'll give an example of how you might do this. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go through those steps in a little bit more detail with some examples. So if we look at the first step, familiarising yourself with your data and generating initial codes and what that might look like. So this is just an example of the sort of approach that I take at this stage. So I'm quite kind of old-fashioned and I'm also quite messy in the way that I work, but that's okay in qualitative analysis. So on this image, what I would tend to do at this stage is print out paper copies of my interview transcripts and kind of sit in a comfy chair with a cup of tea and a pencil and literally just read them and scribble all over them, note down the things that I'm finding interesting. So on the right, I'm sort of picking up as I go some of the things that are interesting. I'm starting to reflect on things that I might use as labels when I start to go into the coding phase. And then on the left, I'm sort of writing some reflections to myself around patterns that I'm starting to see that might eventually become themes. So I'm already doing a lot of that kind of thinking work. There are other ways of doing this. If you're a bit neater than me, you might want to use a Word document or a journal and note down more systematically the thoughts that you had. What I would tend to do is actually just sort of type these up once I've been through it. But it doesn't matter how you do it. The important thing is spending time familiarising yourself with the data. Okay, so we're then ready to go on to more systematically coding your data. So as I said, this is about marking segments of text and labelling them with a word or phrase. And your coding might be selective. So when you go through your transcripts, you might be really clear about what you want to pull out from those transcripts. So, for example, you might be doing some research around people's experiences of being newly diagnosed with a life-limiting condition. And you might be really interested in the emotions that people experience around that diagnosis. So you might decide in your coding to really only focus on pulling out the text where people use words that describe emotions or talk about how they felt around that diagnosis. And that might be, what you need for your analysis. On the other end of the spectrum, you might do more complete coding where you literally code the whole transcript. So you put labels against all the sort of sentences in your transcripts, and then you look back at your codes and start to identify what you want to explore further and develop to build your themes. And I would say that if you're using complete coding, you probably only want to do that on the first few transcripts. But it can be really helpful to help you make sure that you're not missing anything that's important in your data that you might overlook if you went straight to selective coding. So often we'll kind of start with complete coding and move to selective coding. So how do we do this? There's two approaches that you can use. One approach is to do your coding manually. Literally using a kind of highlighter pen where you're going through your transcripts using different colours to highlight bits of text that are relevant to your research question and writing your code next to that highlighted bit of text. And this can work quite well if you've got quite a small data set. So for example, fewer than 10 interviews, and it helps you to stay close to those narratives. If you do take that approach, it's really helpful to keep a separate, what we would call a code book, where each time you use a code, you write it down in the code book, and then you can reuse those codes for other interviews to avoid, coding the same concept but using different words. So you're sort of building your coding frame. The other option you've got is to use software. So there's some really good software out there. As I said, it doesn't do the analysis for you, but it can really help you in organising your data and organising your thinking. So I've got a screenshot from NVivo on the slide, and it looks kind of a bit busy, but essentially in the centre of the screenshot, you've got your transcript. And you can see you can go through and again, just sort of highlight a bit of text that you're interested in. And then at the top under free nodes, you can build up a list of codes or labels, and you can just assign one of those labels to that bit of text. And you can also see there's an option to open up a window on the bottom right, and that with the coloured stripes shows you what you've already coded that paragraph to, because you might want to use more than one code to code a particular bit of text. So it's just a really helpful way of kind of organising and keeping track of your data. So thinking about the types of codes that we can use, and I'll give you some examples of this on the next slide. Our codes can either be semantic, where we're just capturing the surface meaning of what's being said in a piece of text, not doing any interpretation. Or they can be latent codes, where as researchers, we're starting to think a bit more deeply about what someone's actually saying. They might not be using those exact words, but what's going on here? What are they saying? How can we interpret what they've said here? and neither of them's better. So usually in your analysis, you use both types of codes. And you might be more reliant on descriptive codes initially. And then as you become really familiar with what's going on in your data, you might move to use more latent codes. And although your code should be very much grounded in the data, you can start to draw on existing frameworks and theories. So if you're in your thinking about what people are saying and in your interpretation, so for example, as a psychologist by background, if someone is talking a lot about how other people around them influence their behaviour, then I might want to bring in theory around behaviour change, and I might want to label that as drawing on social norms. So you can already start to think, how does this link to theory? Okay, so just to give you an example of what that coding might look like, this on the left-hand side shows an extract from an interview transcript with Claire, who's talking about how she feels about starting on treatment for anorexia. So I've kind of underlined the bits of text that I might want to make sure that I capture in my analysis. In the middle, I've got some semantic codes, and then on the right, I've got latent codes. So Claire says, I feel very lucky to have got the treatment. So I've just really summarised that as feels lucky for getting the treatment. And she goes on to say, always with eating disorders, there's this thing like, I'm entitled to this. Am I entitled to this? So she's questioning her entitlement, saying, do I need this level of support? You know, you feel desperate for it, but then you feel so guilty. So I'm picking up, there are two quite interesting things she's saying there. She desperately wants help, and she feels guilty for wanting help. So two kind of emotions going on there. She then goes on to talk about her concerns about being on the programme and saying, I'm concerned that I can't gain any weight because maybe once my weight starts to go up, they might kick me off the programme. So it's so dependent on this weight. So again, keen to capture those points that Claire's making. So we've coded it as worried that gaining weight will lead to treatment being withdrawn, and belief that treatment provision is dependent on weight. And the idea with semantic codes is we just get a summary of what people are saying in their interviews. And you can see, you could almost take Claire's transcript away and you can still see the content and the meaning of what she's saying. Then in the latent codes, as a researcher, we're starting to think a little bit more about what's going on. So we can see that Claire's talking about different emotions. She feels lucky, she desperately wants help, but she also feels guilty. So a latent code might be being emotionally conflicted about accessing treatment. And then in the second part, we might be looking at the fact that she's worried about treatment being withdrawn, and we might code that as a latent code of feeling that entitlement to treatment is precarious. So they allow us to do a little bit more interpretation. Okay, so I've got a little task for you now. So I'd like to ask you to have a go at coding. So I've got a very short extract from an interview with a patient talking about their experience of having lupus and about their symptoms. I'm going to post this in the chat in a second, and hopefully you can pick it up as a Word document. So I just want you to spend about 5 minutes going through and coding kind of almost on a sentence by sentence basis, and perhaps using semantic codes. So seeing if you can summarise in 2 or 3 words what is being said in each part of this extract. Okay, so I'm hoping I can stop sharing and post in the chat. No, I don't have an option to post. Patricia, would you be able to post a document that I've shared? I think because I'm not an owner of this, I can't share it.
Okay, where will I get it from? You've already sent it to me, haven't you?
Yeah, I sent it to you.
Yeah. Heck, I have to find it. Sorry.
Okay. In the meantime, what I can do, if I put that back on the screen, what might be easier is actually if you look at it on the screen and you just sort of note down for yourself what code you would use for each of the points that you want to pull out. so hopefully people can.
Can you make it bigger again, please?
How's that? Okay.
Thank you.
So just spend a few minutes, seeing if you can come up with some codes.
Just copied and pasted it, Carolyn. I don't know if that's what you meant.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So, okay, you might not have got to the bottom, but that's fine. So hopefully that's giving you an opportunity to sort of think about how you might go about labelling bits of text that might be of interest for you. I'm just going to see if I can swap my screens around. So yeah, the point of coding is that we all might pull out something slightly different from this extract, depending on what, you know, our area of research interest might be, what things particularly speak to us. But here's an example of how I might code this data, and you can have a look and see if I'm picking up similar things to you or different things. So you can see I've coded this quite intensively. I've coded it line by line. It's very complete coding. And I'm sort of trying to do this semantically, so just summarise what's in this little piece of data. So just to kind of give a few examples, I've coded, if you had lupus, I mean, one day it's my liver, one day it's my joints, one day it's my head. So that's something interesting about symptoms changing and shifting. So I've coded that as shifting symptoms. This person then goes on to say, well, it's like people think you're a hypochondriac if you keep complaining about different ailments. So all I want to capture there is this perception that someone might be seen as a hypochondriac by others. They're then going to say it's like you don't want to say anything. So I've coded that as not wanting to speak about the condition, because people are going to start thinking, you know, don't go near her. All she is complaining about this. So I've coded that as fearing rejection. So you can see I'm using quite short summaries of what this person is saying in their interview. They talk about avoiding telling others. They go on to say that symptoms are connected, that others are unaware of their diagnosis, and so on. So again, if you take that away, you can sort of get a summary of what this person's saying in their interview. So we'll come back to those codes when we look at how we might build themes. Okay, so once we've generated some codes, we can start to search for themes. And the main way that we might want to do that is through collating our codes together. So looking across our codes and seeing where there are codes that seem to be about similar things, bringing them together and interpreting what seems to be going on. And then reviewing our themes. So we'll have a look at some examples of that. So yeah, what we want to do at this stage is collapse or cluster our codes together. So you have a set of codes that kind of seem to reflect something that's kind of coherent, that's kind of a meaningful pattern in your data. So one way you can approach doing that, again, it's kind of quite an old school way, is to use post-it notes on a piece of flip chart paper. So in this example on the slide, the researcher has written some of their codes on blue post-it notes, and they've stuck them on a bit of paper and moved them around to look at how they seem to group together. So for example, in the middle at the top, there's a set of codes around having options, having choices, being in control, and so on. And the researchers decided to cluster those around a theme of autonomy. So they're looking at ways they can bring their codes together in ways that kind of make sense. And I think this is often the most challenging part of analysis, because there are lots of different ways you can organise your codes. So it's really for you as the researcher to work out the best way of organising things that helps you answer your research question and that makes a good interpretation of your data set. And this is really quite a creative, interpretative process. So it's a time when you can just sort of play about with things. You might use sort of big flip charts and pens. You can do this to some extent in NVivo. There are functions you can use to group your codes together. So it's just working out what is going to work for you. So just to take a moment to think about what themes are, you often hear people talking about their themes emerging from the data. And this kind of suggests that your themes are already out there in the data, and all you have to do as a researcher is kind of get the spade out and dig them up, and there they are, like buried treasure. But I think it's more helpful to kind of recognise that we need to see themes as being actively created by the researcher. So we use the tools in our qualitative analysis approach to construct our themes out of our codes. And in doing that, we're drawing on our own particular interests, our own perhaps disciplinary positioning, whether we're a psychologist with an interest in behaviour or a sociologist with an interest in, you know, structural factors and how that shape practices. We might be drawing on particular theoretical frameworks to help us make sense of the data, and that can help us decide how we group our codes together in themes. And yeah, the themes you choose to focus on and draw out will depend on your research questions, on your thinking about what issues are most relevant and what are most meaningful for your research. So these themes that you develop can be very inductive. So they can come from clustering together your codes and thinking about what patterns you're seeing in the data in a very kind of ground up sort of way. Or they can be a bit more deductive. So you might be aware of particular theories or frameworks that might help you make sense of your data. And you might want to draw on some concepts from pre-existing theories or frameworks as ways of organising your codes. And either of those is okay, and you might end up using a combination of both. When you're starting to search and look for patterns across your codes, some of the things that can be helpful to look for might be to look for frequently mentioned subjects. So, for example, if you're talking to patients about their healthcare, you might find they talk quite a lot about the nature of their relationship with healthcare professionals, about trust, about having time, about them listening and so on. So that might become a theme that you develop. You might start to notice particular aspects of people's experiences or views that you're interested in. So, for example, you might notice there's a lot of codes around fear and anxiety around a health condition, and that might be something that you bring together. Or you might spot particular ways of talking about something. So you might see that when people talk about themselves in relation to their illness, they use quite a lot of negative words or negative terminology. So that might become a theme around sort of negative self-identity in relation to the illness. So it's about you thinking about how you want to pull your codes together. Okay, so if we come back to this coding that we've done on this transcript from a patient with lupus, what I want you to do is to look at the codes that I've used and to see if you can see any codes that you feel you would pull together into a theme. So are there kind of commonalities across some of these codes? I'm just going to get you to think about that for a minute. I think I can see the chat. So if anyone wanted to pop any ideas in the chat in terms of what they see might be a theme, not necessarily across all of the codes, but just 2 or 3 or 4 of the codes. Anyone want to have a go and suggest something? I'm going to take that as a no. And I am going to share my thoughts on how some of these codes might group together as themes. So when I looked at this data set and I did my coding, I could sort of felt that I could see some common threads running through what the person was saying in their interview. So I sort of highlighted these themes around perceptions of hypochondria and anticipating disbelief about anticipating disbelief about their symptoms. So this sense that people wouldn't believe them if they did speak up because their symptoms were so variable, and people wouldn't believe they were all the same thing. So I thought that was one thing that kind of came together. And related to that, this person talked a lot about not wanting to speak about their condition, about avoiding telling others, and that this was associated with this sense that people wouldn't believe them. So I thought it would work quite well to bring some of these things together into themes. So you'll see why they're on the right hand side in a minute, but One way of organising that data was to bring your codes together into two themes, which are quite descriptive. So one is a theme of anticipating disbelief. So the person thinking that others wouldn't believe in their symptoms. And the other one is around avoiding disclosure, so not wanting to speak up. And we've only looked at one extract, but you can see that you might see those things coming up repeatedly across different interviews of different patients. So those work quite well as themes, but if we want to be really sort of thinking about how we interpret and make sense of our data, we might want to go further than that. So looking at the data and thinking about some of those things that people were talking about, I might then want to go away and look at the literature and look at theory around living with chronic conditions. And so I am aware of the idea of stigma and how chronic conditions can be stigmatizing. And in looking at the data and looking at the literature, I would suggest that we can understand and we can draw together those two themes around a bigger theme of how patients have to manage felt stigma. So felt stigma is defined as shame and expectation of discrimination that prevents people from talking about their experiences. So you can kind of see how we can draw on theory to help us interpret what's going on within the data, and that might become a theme that we've brought all our kind of codes together under. And when you bring your codes together under a theme, you still have a link back to the original text that was labelled under that code. So you can then look at that theme and look back at your data and say, well, I've understood this as about a process of managing felt stigma. Does that seem to reflect, now I look back at my data, does that seem to fit what I can see in that data? So this is maybe just one theme that we could pull out of a bigger data set on interviews with patients with lupus. And you can see that on the left there's a dotted line. So as you develop your themes, you might want to draw them out and create lines to show how they link to other themes in your data set. So this is an example of a thematic map that we're kind of working towards as we're developing our themes and thinking about how they're related to each other. So this comes from a publication. It's a qualitative study with patients with lupus, and the way that they've analysed their data, they've identified 3 core themes, and I think you can see how they relate to the extract that we saw earlier. So they're in grey on the centre of the slide. You can see that they've got a theme around invisibility of the condition, so the idea that it's not a condition that's visible, that other people can see. They've got a theme around experiencing inadequate care, and a theme about the need for validation, so for other people to acknowledge the reality of their condition. In their map, they're showing how those themes are interrelated, and they're also showing some of the kind of sub-themes or factors that are important to recognise when we think about each of those themes. So under the theme of validation, the researchers have picked up that people need validation both in terms of emotional support, but also in terms of information about the condition. And actually, it's important that they have that support through linking up with other patients with the same condition, but also have that support from medical professionals. So that's what we're kind of working towards, having this map of our themes. So once we're happy with our thematic map, we're then moving on to write up our findings. And again, there's kind of skill in how we go about doing this. So what we're doing when we write up is we're writing an analytical narrative. So we're sort of taking a step back from our map and trying to kind of write the story of each theme. So to describe to your reader what the theme means and why it's important. So we're writing our story, and when we do that, what we also need to do is to bring in data extracts, so to bring in quotes from our interviews or focus groups that act as evidence for why you've constructed that theme. So the reader can look at your data and say, yeah, I can see why they've got that theme, I can see what it means. And then we need to think about the so what question. What new understandings have we generated through our analysis? So just to give an example of how those last 2 stages might look, when we're writing up, this is an extract from the same paper that I showed you the thematic map from. And here in their findings section of their paper, they're writing up the theme of the invisible nature of lupus. And you can see on the top part of the slide, that first bit is a narrative text around what the theme is about and what it means. So they're describing what individuals who they interviewed said about their experience of lupus as invisible. So how they talked about the fact that they looked physically normal, and it meant that people around them responded negatively or disbelievingly to their diagnosis. And that was associated with them feeling psychologically invalidated and potentially being someone who's seen as a complainer. So they've summarised their theme, and they're then showing us some quotes from interviews to evidence that theme. So, you know, the first quote, someone says, "Oh, on the outside, people think you look well and healthy, rosy red cheeks, picture of health." And that means that they don't believe you and you feel demoralised. So we need to tell the readers the story of our findings, but then we also need to tell them, so what? So this extract comes from the same paper again, from their discussion section, and they start by summarising their findings. They talk about how people with lupus can feel alone and isolated and experience negative responses. But they then go on to say, and this could deter them from disclosing their symptoms and their condition to others, or it could deter them from seeking support. And this is evidenced by the data that they found in the interviews. So they go on to argue that we need to improve awareness of lupus in the general population, and also we need to improve awareness in the population of GPs and other clinicians, so that patients don't feel that they can't disclose and talk about their problems, that they will be believed and they'll be able to get support. Okay, so I just want to spend very briefly to say something about reflexivity. So Braun and Clark have written quite a bit more recently about how thematic analysis needs to be undertaken with reflexivity. So they talk about reflexive thematic analysis. And their argument is that, yes, it provides us with a set of tools that we can use for analysing data, but we shouldn't just unthinkingly apply them in a step-by-step process, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, we need to really appreciate that analysis is interpretative. We need to sort of think about who we are and what we bring and how we're making sense of the data. And we also need to recognise that our analysis process is going to be iterative. So we might start initially by familiarisation and doing some initial coding. We might then identify some preliminary themes. Then we might come back and look at our coding frame again, our codes, and adapt those based on the sorts of things that we've identified as potential themes and do some more coding. So it involves back and forth, and really importantly involves you as a researcher thinking all the time about the sense you're making out of your data. So it's about, as researchers, being aware of our role in the construction of meaning, that we are creating these themes, that it is a subjective process, but we need to make sure our analysis is robust and that we are able to present it in ways that seem credible to readers. So part of that is being very transparent about the methods that you've used, but also showing how you've reflected on your own position and how that might have affected the way that the research is conducted, the questions that you've asked, and the sorts of themes that you've ended up with. It's about thinking critically about your findings and reflecting on your ideology and your disciplinary position and how that has shaped your research. So we can do this. We need to be reflexive throughout the whole process of data collection and analysis. From doing interviews, we need to be thinking about how we were feeling, what we were thinking about. We need to be acknowledging our assumptions that we're making, thinking about how we can make sure we don't close down lines of questioning in our interviews because they don't line up with our expectations, how we might do things differently in subsequent interviews to make sure that we remain open, and so on. So some really useful things to do as a researcher is, first of all, keep a reflexive diary during the research process where you write down your notes and reflections during interviewing or during conducting focus groups and during analysis, and thinking about those assumptions you're making, thinking about what you might like to do differently going forward. And then also taking notes and making memos throughout the process of coding and constructing themes. So you have got a audit trail of how you ended up with those findings and the themes that you've got, and that's transparent. So you're very clear about where you've drawn on theory, for example. And obviously, when you write up the research, it's worth saying something about your own background and your own particular orientation when you report the research, so the reader can take that into account when they're interpreting your findings. Okay, so to sort of wrap up, I would argue that good thematic analysis involves researchers spending time with their early stages, familiarisation with the data, and using codes that represent the data and doing thorough coding. It goes beyond using the data collection questions as themes. So you're not just directly answering a question you've asked in an interview, but you're looking more interpretatively at the patterns that are there in your interview transcripts. You're developing themes that provide nuanced and complex interpretations of data. And when you write up, you're not too heavily reliant on your data, but you actually are telling your story of your findings, but using your data to evidence this story and showing evidence of reflexivity. So overall, we want to think about, do the themes we've ended up with provide a rich, coherent analysis that answers the research question, and that we can say, so what have we learned? And then finally, just to flag up a couple of really useful resources. So I really like this book by Braun and Clark, which is broadly about qualitative research methods. It's very accessible. It's a really good guide to conducting qualitative research and to thematic analysis. And then also, I recommend this paper by Byrne. So this is somebody who has published a worked example of thematic analysis. So you can sort of look at their research and look step by step how they've undertaken each step of thematic analysis. So that can be really useful if it's something that you're planning yourself. Okay, so I am going to stop there, and I think we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I am back. I've only had to restart my computer 3 times. So there are some questions in the chat. So let me go all the way back to the first one. So we had a question from Leanne, who said, do you have to start thematic analysis after all of the interviews have been completed? So I started to answer on your behalf and said, well, I wouldn't, but you know. Yeah. I mean, it's good practice to start your analysis as early as you can. So, you know, almost as soon as you've done the first interview, you can start familiarisation. You can start to think about what initial codes you might use. And that's really important, because it means that your initial thoughts about what's interesting in your data can then inform subsequent data collection. You might decide to tweak your interview topic guide to explore some things in more depth that are starting to come out of your analysis. The next question is from Tanya and says, I've had PPIE review my research, and they've suggested a small separate group of patients and relatives aid with thematic analysis. At what point would you suggest they should be involved in the coding process?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think increasingly researchers are starting to recognise that, the actual value of getting patients and relatives involved. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because almost at any stage, but thinking pragmatically, I would think it's probably easiest if you've done some coding already and you've got a coding frame that you're relatively happy with. You could then ask them to code into that coding frame and get them to think about, does that work? Are you capturing the things that they're seeing in the data? Is there anything else, any other codes that they would want to add? So that feels really helpful. And then if they've been involved at that stage, you can also then go back to them when you've got your initial themes and go through that process again. You've done some coding. Do these themes reflect the sorts of things you were seeing in the data when you were coding it?
Lovely, thank you. So the next question is from Melissa. Do you have suggestions for coding as a team in NVivo in terms of how not to bias your coding if you can see others' codings, or would you suggest everybody codes individually first?
Okay, so we have done this in research that I've done, and the approach we would tend to take is that people involved in coding, so we usually do this before we've established a coding frame, that people go away and do their own coding separately of maybe 2 or 3 transcripts, and then they would then come together and compare and agree, yeah, a coding frame they're all happy to use. If you do that though, and then they go away and do some more coding, because sometimes people end up having to work on different versions of NVivo, you have to put them together, make sure you've got a way of capturing what each person has added to their coding frame.
So next one, if you're interviewing over a year period, would you recommend coding all at once or as you go? I think we've already done that one.
Definitely.
Yeah,
as you go. Yeah, as you go.
Yeah, and then here's a really novel one. What are your thoughts about using an AI tool such as ChatGPT to test reliability?
Reliability of coding. Okay. Oh, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's do the reliability of coding first. So there are different schools of thought in the field of qualitative research about whether you should be looking at iterator reliability. I would sort of side with those who suggest it's not a particularly helpful thing to do. And Braun and Clark certainly take that position quite explicitly, because when you're doing analysis around things that are quite subjective, people's experiences of illness, there's no one kind of correct way of coding that. So I as a researcher might code that differently to somebody else. So if you're just concerned, if you're just one researcher coding your own data, then we don't need to sort of necessarily think about iterator reliability, because you're probably doing it right. You're looking for things that matter to you. And you can check your own consistency by keep looking back at your codes and what you've coded. There's a broad question around the use of AI in qualitative analysis, which I think it'd be interesting to see how that unfolds. At the moment, it's tricky because if you use AI, you're essentially putting your data into cloud software, and obviously there are huge data security issues and things around that. So, but you know, that might change in the future.
Okay, so next one, you've been very popular with the questions today, Carolyn. At what point do you put your transcripts into NVivo, and do you have to go on an NVivo course in order to use it?
Okay. So if you're using it, if you've got a small number of transcripts, obviously you can do it by hand, that's fine. If you're going to use NVivo, I would put, after I'd done the familiarization, I would go straight into NVivo. So I would do even that initial detailed open coding in NVivo, because then you might end up with a huge long list of codes, but you can then cluster them together and develop a more structured coding frame. So I think using NVivo from the start is really helpful. In terms of a course, if you can go on a course, yes, definitely. There are some quite helpful training videos, kind of, is it QSR who who hosts NVivo? So on their website, they've got lots of really nice training videos.
It moves us next on to the last question we've got at the moment. What other good quality thematic courses are available, and what should we be looking for in terms of course structure or credentials?
Okay, so a good place to look is on the National Centre for Research Methods website, because they will advertise, you know, accredited high quality courses provided by a university and other organisations. I think it's really good to look at the people who are running it. So if you can kind of Google them and check that you're happy with their experience as qualitative researchers, and then looking for something where you have an opportunity to practice, because I appreciate this is just like an hour's introduction, and it's really, really helpful to spend time with dummy data, working through all these steps.
Lovely. I'm just multitasking and putting some links in the chat as well. So let's put the NatSen thing link in, and it's probably not the right course, but there's also Cactus, who do lots of kind of computer assisted quality analysis as well, that's available. Lovely. So I think we have got all of the questions sorted. Anybody got any last questions for Carolyn? No, perfect. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise and skills this afternoon, Carolyn. We very much appreciate it. For everybody else, we will be uploading this video onto the ARC YouTube channel as soon as my computer stops misbehaving. Yeah, thanks. We'll be sending out the feedback form. If you could complete, that'd be perfect. And please do sign up for any of the other ARC training sessions. Next week, I think we've got impact and implementation sessions. So there's normally something going on most weeks now until July. So thanks all for your time. Thank you again, Carolyn.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry, just give me a minute while I go into presenter view. Okay.